and he plays the role of an exegetical advisor and local coordinator. And he is also a consultant in training. So over to you, Alex.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming for this session. And connecting with the theme of our conference, I would like to make a presentation which I entitled The Prince of Rosh in Russia, How a Bible Translation Can Lead to Prejudice. I would like to begin with a few statements. Ethics in Bible translation implies the accurate rendition of the original text without one's theological, ideological, or political bias. In practice, however, many Bible translations reflect certain denominational or ideological overtones. Bias may enter a translation unintentionally due to incorrect understanding of difficult scripture passages, the possibility of multiple interpretation, unclear language of the original, or linguistic challenges. And I would like to present a study which is based on a particular case in the history of Bible translation. It is based on the representation of the person of Magog in Ezekiel in the Septuagint and its dependent versions. So in the Bible, we find two accounts of Gog and Magog, Ezekiel 38 and 39 in the Old Testament, and in the book of Revelation, chapter 20 in New Testament. Just one window is covering my notes. So prophet Ezekiel, he lived during the time of Babylonian captivity, in the 6th century BC, and his prophecy begins with these following words: "Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him." And further, he lists a few more nations. So these people, the armies of these people are going to invade the land of Israel with the goal of seizing great booty, but God will punish them and completely destroy them. So let me see, go to next slide. In Revelation 20, we find again these two names. Either these are two individuals or nations deceived by Satan. Those located at the four corners of the earth comprise all nations of the world. They prepare themselves to wage war against God's people and the city of Jerusalem, but will be destroyed by divine intervention. So we find these two accounts in the Bible. When we talk about Ezekiel's prophecy, there are different opinions, two opinions. Some scholars think that these are two separate events. In Ezekiel, it already was accomplished sometime in the history, maybe during the post-exilic period. Most of the scholars, whatever I read, is they think that this event, prophecy of Ezekiel, is linked to the book of Revelation. So it has eschatological nature. So it has to do in the future, after the 1,000 years. That's what we read in Ezekiel. So when we discuss the person of Gog, who is this person? This name is one of the most mysterious in the Bible. We find him only in the Old Testament. We find him in the First Chronicles, chapter 5, where a man with this name is listed among the descendants of Joel, and nothing more is known about him. There are two references found in the Septuagint, but for the lack of time, we won't discuss them. Most modern scholars suggest that the name Gog derives from Gyges, or Gyges, how would you like to pronounce it. He was the king of Lydia in Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. And he is mentioned in 6 Assyrian inscriptions in the 7th century BC. That's according to the modern studies. However, the king Gigas reigned 50 or more years prior to the time of Ezekiel, and the country Lydia has never posed any serious threat to Judah. Another mysterious name is Magog. We find him in Genesis chapter 10 and its parallel place in First Chronicles, where he is mentioned as the second son of Japheth. Many centuries later, Jewish historian Josephus, he lived during the Jesus times, he equated them with the Scythians. This is also a very broad term, and however, we can't be sure that Magog of Ezekiel is the same as assumed by Josephus many centuries later. It is also interesting that the names of Gog and Magog in a bit different form are mentioned in the Quran, Yajuj and Majuj. Early rabbinic tradition saw the name Magog as cipher for Babylon, and early Christian writers sometimes identified him with the Romans, and then later Goths, Huns, Khazars, and Mongols, and so on. Later, with the appearance of the old Rus on the historical stage, and especially with the connection of the military campaigns of Prince Sviatoslav against Byzantium in the 10th century AD, the first statements were made that Magog was the land of the Rus. So you need to remember this date, 10th century AD. That was probably the earliest mentioning where Gog and Magog are linked with Old Russia. But according to modern scholars, Magog is most probably derived, it's a form, it's a Hebrew form of the Akkadian Magog, which means the land of Gog, which is again Lydia in Asia Minor. So the main problem here, when we look at the Hebrew text, the expression that designates Gog in Ezekiel, it sounds in Hebrew like Nesi, Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. The problem how we should interpret this expression, we'll discuss a little bit, but first, when you read different English versions, you will see a difference. This Gog is, in some versions, he's mentioned as the chief prince or ruler, but there are some other versions in English that say the prince of Rosh, where Rosh is some kind of a country or people's name. Most versions prefer the chief prince. However, we find Rosh in some Bibles, like you see here in red, which are highlighted in red. In search for possible clues, scholars look into ancient versions. An interesting case is found in Septuagint. Its translators assumed the Hebrew word Rosh to be a proper noun, the name of a people group or land. Therefore, they rendered it as the phrase Nesi Rosh. In Hebrew, they rendered as Arkontaros, because Greek, it doesn't have sh sound, so they spell it as a Ros. And the story goes further. I'll skip some of the information. There are other translators, Greek translations of the Old Testament, and they also differ in their interpretation. Now we come to the Church Slavonic Bible. It is very heavily drawn on the Septuagint in Old Testament part, and it even reflects the phonological adaptations of Hebrew names. So we have this Prince of Ros as Knyazia Ros. A few centuries later, when the first printed Bible in Old Slavonic came in 1581, we find here even more adaptation. I don't know the reason, but now it sounds like Knyazia Roska, which sounds like the Russian prince. This is amazing. I don't know what is behind this decision. I tried to find out. The town of Ostrog is located in modern Ukraine, Western Ukraine, and that territory for some centuries it was under the influence of Poland and Polish Commonwealth. So I don't exclude any political reasons behind that, but I'm not sure. So this is the page of that Bible, first printed Bible in Old Slavonic, where I underlined Roska, the Russian prince, probably. So there has been no consensus among Bible expositors on how to interpret this Hebrew word Rosh and this expression. And I've collected some opinions, and here in the chart you see different opinions of scholars. Many of them, especially among the old scholars, they think this Rosh is toponym as a place for some name. Some were asserting that this is specifically Russia. Among them are famous scholar Gesenius, Schofield, and last century Hal Lindsey in the US. He was a Christian writer and TV host. Others also were feeling that this is a kind of a name, but they were not sure which one. Delichkil and J.T. Price, they suggest that probably we deal here with a country called Rashu or Reshu, which is mentioned in some Assyrian inscriptions. But this land is a bit far from other lands mentioned in Ezekiel. And modern scholars, among them are Simons, Yamochi, and Bloch, they support the idea that Rosh has to be interpreted as an adjective, meaning chief. And they think that identification of Rosh with Russia is anachronistic and untenable. So the Hebrew word Rosh, basically it means head, human or animal head, and figuratively it means chief or leader. And as such, it occurs more than 600 times in the Hebrew Bible. There is only one occurrence where a person with this name is mentioned in Genesis 46. He's mentioned as son of Benjamin. So we deal here with the problematic Hebrew syntax. For the lack of punctuation marks and no difference between uppercase and lowercase letters, this phrase, Nesi, Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, can be interpreted in possibly three ways. As the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, so all three are place names, or maybe the prince, leader of Meshech and Tubal, or the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. So these three interpretations are possible if we don't look at the marks. Hebrew vocalization and cantillation marks, we know they were introduced later by the Masoretes. Sometimes they can help clarify syntactic difficulties, but in this passage of Ezekiel, they are not really helpful, and some scholars point to this. Like we see this construct state, Nesi, Rosh, so it's supposed to be conjunctive, but on the top, this is a cantillation mark, which is disjunctive. I won't go too much into these details, but I've collected some information here. So it's difficult to interpret based only on this marks. Let's skip the slides. There is another feature in the Hebrew grammar, which is called polysyndeton. When there are successive nouns, Hebrew uses conjunction vav, which means and, this and this and this and this. So some scholars say that if a Rosh is a place name, then we need to have another v, like it should look like this. Nesi Rosh u Meshech v'Tubal. However, in Ezekiel, it's not like that. But there are other scholars who say that this polysyndeton is not always a rule in Hebrew, and they provide other passages in the Hebrew Bible where it is not always consistent. So there are arguments and counter arguments. Another strong argument, to my opinion, is provided by J.D. Price, who says that this word Rosh if if it is an adjective, chief prince, he thinks it functions as a kind of intervening. It shouldn't be like this, like Nesi Meshech with Tubal. If we say prince of Meshech and Tubal, and then we want to insert an adjective, the main or chief prince. So it's kind of being inserted here. So J.D. Price says that this is a syntactic anomaly. It shouldn't work like this in Hebrew. I haven't found any counter arguments to this. So, okay, if we think that this is some kind of a land or country, who then is this Rosh? Or what is this land? We know that Ezekiel spoke of lands and peoples known to him. He didn't speak of somebody fictional like Atlantis or Hyperborea. He didn't talk about countries that didn't exist during his days. There was no Russia, Turkey, or Eswatini that we heard recently. He spoke of the lands that existed in his time. Yes, we know there are many names in the Bible which are not, I would say, it's difficult to identify them today. We have a lack of archaeological evidence, linguistic variations are there. But they were real, they were not fantastic or anachronistic. So, and this land called Rashu or Reshu was located too far, even though some scholars say that Ezekiel means this land is there in place of Rosh. Knowledge could change. There are two more mysterious names in this passage of Ezekiel, Meshech and Tubal, mentioned in Genesis 10, the sons of Japheth, also in Ezekiel and two more places. And in all these few places, these two are antagonistic to God and his people. And Rosh is not mentioned along with them. An interesting place is found in Psalm 120, verse 5, where Meshech is used in the figurative sense. Here it says, "Woe to me that I sojourn in Meshech." So here Meshech stands for barbarians or savages in general, not specific country. So it's good to remember this point. Meshech and Tubal were well attested in the Assyrian records, and also they were known to Herodotus. Some more nations are mentioned in Ezekiel, and among them I would like to mention Gomer and Togarma. These nations have also lived in modern-day Turkey. So I've already mentioned some scholars like Gesenius in the 19th century. He was quite sure that Rosh stands for Russia. He wrote in his famous lexicon. Schofield in the early 20th century, he said, all scholars agree, according to him. And then Hal Lindsey was there in the US. He wrote a book which became a bestseller in 1970. Let me see, his book was called The Late Great Planet Earth. And there was a movie shown, according to this book, it was shown on American TV. And actually had quite a strong impact on the evangelical thinking. People in the US and even some people in the government were influenced by this interpretation. So, and there was another scholar, the Japanese origin, he is in America, Edwin Yamochi. He undertook his own research and he actually found that this has nothing to do with Russia. So it's also interesting research he has done from historical point of view. So what happens when people randomly interpret the scripture? One scholar called Zygmunt Becker, he characterized it as a hermeneutical disease. When people give bizarre interpretation to biblical prophecies, sometimes they compare apocalyptic texts with the current events in an attempt to predict future scenarios. But those predictions often turn out faulty, and we have many this kind of end time predictions. So we know the phonetic similarity between Rosh and Russia. Yes, it's there, but in modern days it's more like a folk etymology rather than a real derivation. So of course that Septuagint played an important role why future translators and interpreters begin to think in this way. And of course there's political propaganda. I believe scholars also get influenced by propaganda. So there's using some cliche about the Russian menace and this and that. And actually in the old days, people were afraid of somebody who is remote. The further north people live, the more barbarous and scary they appear to people. One more thing I would like to mention is north in the Old Testament prophets. Like people who claim that Rosh is Russia, they often point that it is somewhere in the north, which is mentioned in Ezekiel, uttermost north. But when we read carefully the prophecies, Old Testament prophecies, we usually see that north is linked with Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, which is not directly to the north, like in a compass, but it's rather northeast. Look on the map. Yeah, because there's Syrian desert in the middle, and all the invaders and trade routes, they were going around this desert. So they were going around and coming from the north. That's why maybe one of the reasons they say it's north. It's not necessary like on a compass. And we should also understand that the biblical world was much smaller than what we know now, or a huge world. It was limited by Crimea, mountains in the Caucasus, and what lied beyond was unknown. It was completely terra incognita. There's another map here. Mongolia, you can see Mongolia is it's written there Magog, where Mongolia is now. Magog is there. They thought in the 17th century, I think. So sometimes they ignore the history or distort the history they presented from specific angle, and people think, oh, this is something scary and threatening. So there are hermeneutic errors, like I mentioned. Most probably this prophecy is eschatological and refers to future events after the millennial kingdom. And another point is it's difficult to identify these countries and nations. So maybe this nation's name needs to be understood as symbolic, like we saw in Psalm 120. Maybe they're symbolic. They stand for enemies of God's people in general. So there are some suggestions when we deal with this kind of text. Yes, I acknowledge the ambiguity of this text. So that there might be two interpretations. Maybe Prince of Rosh, maybe Rosh is some kind of a land which is not attested. But yeah, it can be interpreted as chief prince, which many versions do these days, nowadays. We can supply footnote, possibly. We can think of these names as symbolic. But even if we supply footnote, we should not bring any biased information or somebody's interpretation which is colored by politics or ideology. So at the conclusion that we have to be very careful when we deal with these passages. Like in Ezekiel, here we see that linguistics may come across politics and ideology. These decisions, especially made by some authoritative translators, they can be exploited in the future. And inadequate interpretations may encroach in Bible translations and all these paratextual features. So we have to pay very close attention to the way we read and interpret biblical texts and avoid being guided by popular trends. In this way, the work will not have unexpected results or unwanted consequences in the future. We know that some of the decisions, they affected even politics and even led to wars, unfortunately. So that's basically what I wanted to share with you. And questions? because they transliterated this word, because there is another translation done in the 2nd century AD, Aquila. He translated as chief prince, but the Septuagint text says archontaros, which they just transliterated this name. So most probably either place or people group, because they didn't give the meaning, what is Ros? And that's what further versions like Russian, Slavonic Russian, and other languages, they just follow this, they capitalize, and so it's some kind of country or people group. So I think, yes. Yes, it's in the Slavonic Bible and in the synodal, Russian synodal Bible. Probably it is not. It's not in modern Bibles, modern translations. Yes. Okay,
let me do it the correct way. Two comments. For the general principle of this paper of how the rendering of place names may have political and social implications, you may like to consider putting a parallel with the issue of the curse on Canaan. In Bible translation in Africa, that has a huge significance because Canaan was the son of Ham, and many people, perhaps influenced by earlier generation of missionaries who saw Africa as somehow cursed, because of course the curse is on Canaan, not on Ham, but people then apply it to Ham. But I've not heard that from Western people. I've heard it from Africans saying the reason why Africa is underdeveloped is because of the curse on Ham. Ham is not cursed, but anyway, that's how they read it. So there is a reading tradition there that has significant ethical implications for the place of the Bible within society. So that seems to be quite a nice parallel to what you're presenting here. But as far as this particular cases are concerned, I wonder if anybody has tried to see if there's an atbash happening with these cases, that with Meshech and Tubal. You know that in Jeremiah there are 3 places where an atbash technique is used, where it actually it says Sheshech, Shin Shin Kaf, to represent Bavel, right? Where it takes puts the second to last letter of the alphabet instead of the second letter of the alphabet. It has a kind of code. Has anybody tried to see if one of these has somehow a code in it? Is a kind of coded way to refer to nations that everybody would have known? You know, in Jeremiah, I think people understand that it was done deliberately to protect the author or the carriers of the manuscript from, I suppose, government forces. It was a code, right? What do you think, Adam?
Thank you. I don't remember if Rosh has been interpreted like a cipher. I'm not sure, but what you mentioned, I remember I read in sources. I haven't heard about that. But a good comment about this Ham and the curse. I heard it long ago back in Russia. I read it somewhere. It is really true. So sometimes through that, stigmatizing all nations and countries, demonizing, etc.
How do the Orthodox and the Baptist Russian churches, how does it affect their theology and their thought process, this text?
Thank you. I cannot speak for everyone. We used to read it. First of all, these texts are not very widely read in churches. Sometimes we don't know. We read it in Russian, some kind of name, and most of the people don't dig and they don't know where the other names. They just somewhere in the Middle East probably. But long ago, I think in the 90s, first I heard this interpretation that Rosh refers to Russia. I don't know where it came from. Maybe from Schofield. Like my mom used to read the Bible with Schofield commentaries, and she loved commentaries of Schofield. Maybe it was from there where I heard first. And so from those 90s, I started thinking sometimes whether it's a valid theory, or at that time I didn't study texts and I was not involved in Bible translation. I was just a teenager. So, but later it came back to my mind and I decided to dig a little bit and find out where it comes from, this theory or hypothesis. But there is an interesting thing about Meshech. There is a legend that says Meshech is in the form of Mosoch, Greek form. He was the founder of Moscow, but it's just a legend. Yes. And I think, I don't know where it came from, but I think sometimes people want to become famous. You know, when Russia was established in 15th century, 16th century, maybe they wanted some kind of valid proof that they are also there in the Bible. So even though the character is not so good, but at least we're there. I don't know where it's. I think it's in Kiev. The document is called Kievan synopsis. It was written in Kiev, and so they mentioned that the founding of Moscow, the king Mosoch, which is Meshech in the Bible. Yeah, I didn't mention that. Actually, I found so many interesting things, but within this 20 minutes, I couldn't mention everything. Maybe if I get to publish this material, I can write more about it. Thank you. A minute, something is there.
Could you just point us to the place? I think you said there's one place where Hebrew Rosh is a name clearly.
Yes, it's in Genesis, I think. Genesis 46:21. The son of Benjamin. That's the only place where Rosh is interpreted as a name, but yeah, it's mentioned as a person. Nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible. Thank you.